Hi folks, welcome to the A Minute to Midnight Show. This is Tony coming to you from New Zealand. With me on the show today, I have a frequent guest, Alex Newman, who I'm sure needs no great introduction. Everyone that follows our show will know you, I'm sure, and probably plenty of other people. So it's good to talk to you again, Alex.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Tony.
No problem. So there's a lot happening, tons of stuff we could cover, but I mentioned to you off air I'd really like to at least start with the new 59-page report that UNESCO put out. And under the Director General, Audrey Azoulay, who's basically a French socialist, doesn't look too good.
Yeah, it's not good at all. It's just the next step in the UNs war on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, online communications, freedom of thought even. They're making this look like an effort to crack down on what they describe as misinformation, disinformation, false information, lies, hate speech, all things that have a nasty smell. Nobody wants misinformation, lies, hate speech, etc. But what they don't tell you is what that really means. Now, they give you some examples of the kind of speech they want to suppress. They talk about, concerns about public health measures. Why would anybody be concerned about the public health measures? Oh, goodness, who knows? They talk about the desirability of silencing climate skeptics, not in this report in particular, but as part of the broader war on speech that the UN has been waging. They actually entered into a partnership with Google to suppress anything that discredits or contradicts their narrative on global warming. They talk about concerns about elections, right? And even if you don't believe the election in the United States was rigged, and it's neither here nor there for the purposes of our discussion, we know, and we have always known, that elections have been rigged around the world from time immemorial. Right? As long as we've been having elections, people have been trying to rig elections. If you can't talk about election fraud, what happens when there really is election fraud? Right? I mean, maybe it's in Zimbabwe, maybe it's in Laos. I don't know, but why can't we talk about concerns relating to the security of elections? So they're very vague in terms of what they're actually going after, but you don't really have to read between the lines to see what they're trying to do here. They're trying to stop the mass awakening that we're seeing when it comes to the various narratives that they've been spinning on health, on climate, on environment, on the alleged desirability of more UN involvement in our lives. And I think, frankly, Tony, there's a sense in which this is good news. I think they're very concerned that despite all the censorship that's already in place, despite the rigged algorithms on YouTube and fascist book and all the rest of them, people are still waking up and they just don't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, we had just an election here and we've got a new government as of this week sworn in, and the first thing they were doing this week was basically putting a stop on any changes that New Zealand would go along with the WHO. So I don't know what's going to end up coming of it, but after 6 years of a socialist government, we've now got a centre-right sort of government that's a coalition. So there's a bit of push me, pull you going on. But some of the things that they're actually wanting, including an independent inquiry into COVID and the handling of it and the efficacy of the vaccine and things like that, is interesting. I don't trust governments as such, but it's a little refreshing to see some of this after what we've had this last horrible 6 years. But, the fact of the matter is, I really don't think governments as a whole have a lot of say when it comes to some of these overarching things like you're just talking about. They can put in a token gesture, but really, is it going to change getting a digital ID? Is it going to change the censorship and all of these things and the climate change stuff? Though we're going to be getting some more gas and oil exploration again and things like that, which was put on hold before. So I don't know quite where it's going to end up. But it is interesting that there is some pushback against, what we've been getting from the UN and the various agencies over the last few years.
Yeah, no, I think, Tony, we're seeing massive pushback, and I think that's why they're doing this. If people were going along mindlessly with their agenda, there'd be no need to do this. I mean, we'd be going along, so they wouldn't have to silence people who are critical of their agenda. We just had a poll released here some months ago in the United States by a very prestigious, well-known pollster, the AP NORC released a poll showing that most Americans don't believe that humans are causing climate change, right? And I mean, that is a slap in the face to the establishment. They've been bombarding us with this propaganda on every major TV network, every major newspaper, every major magazine, every government indoctrination center masquerading as a school for decades now. And still, a majority of Americans rejects their hypothesis that human emissions of CO2 are causing climate change. So, they realize that truth is very powerful. That's one of the huge advantages that we have, Tony, is that we're speaking the truth as we see it, as best as we understand. And you don't need billions of dollars in censorship to get the truth out there. The truth stands on its own. You need billions of dollars in censorship to promote lies. So, they're in the very unenviable position of having to convince people of things that aren't true. And of course, that requires things like silencing people on the internet. That requires rigging the algorithm. I talked about this when they banned Alex Jones from everything. And, Alex Jones is an interesting case study because this is a guy who completely defies the establishment, who exposes virtually every narrative that they can come up with, and who has been demonized relentlessly for years now. I mean, every negative thing they could call this guy, they called him. And yet, running into the 2016 election, if you just go by the numbers on YouTube, he had more viewers for his election coverage than all of the big media outlets combined on YouTube. More than Fox, more than CNN, more than NBC and ABC and CBS combined. And so, they realize that that's not sustainable. If people have the option, even if they have to search really hard for it, but if there's even the option of getting truth, they're not going to be tuning into the lies, at least not in big enough quantities to be able to advance this agenda. We also see at the congressional level, they like to act like we don't exist. And yet you see in Congress now, Republicans have the majority. We've got a self-proclaimed Bible-believing Christian who's now the leader, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. We've got congressional committees working on defunding all these different UN agencies and programs. And none of that's supposed to be happening, right? We're supposed to just all be in agreement like, little lemmings going over the cliff with the UN. So they recognize that their agenda is in big trouble. Frankly, I think there's a little bit of paranoia on their part. They're thinking, well, hey, if more and more millions of people keep waking up, like they're going to find us and, they're going to throw us in jail for the things that we've done to them. I frankly would not want to be one of them right now. And so I think that is why they're frantically now pushing for more censorship, more regulation, more speech controls. It's because they know the jig is up if this continues.
Well, when you look at climate change and, it was global warming before. Now they've sort of changed the terminology to climate change. I mean, because there's no way, if you're in New Zealand, we could say we're having global warming at this point in time. I mean, spring has been cooler, and things like that than normal. I believe it has, certainly not been hotter. And then you get UNESCO and you've got a bunch of Chinese Communist Party people in UNESCO. So, these are the people that are going to be writing the rules. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party has desires to keep everyone under surveillance and their social credit score system, and they want that all over the world. So why on earth should any of us want that?
Yeah. And the Chinese communist system is actually, I believe, the role model for the planet. They've actually said this. Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, is this role model, the communist Chinese system. George Soros, the guy who put more money into our political process than anybody else on the planet, has said that communist China should own the new world order. David Rockefeller, who now I'm quite sure is rotting in hell, he wrote that in the New York Times, actually, that the social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. So they really do see that as kind of the desirable goal. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, was asked publicly, which is the government system that you most admire? His response was communist China. Then his excuse was because they can invest in green energy. Really? They also imprison their opponents and chomp their organs out and put 2 million people in concentration camps. That is not something that a Western leader should be praising. And so they want that kind of system. And it ties right into the climate change hoax. And I realized this at the UN climate conference in Paris. It was so obvious when they came up with the Paris Agreement that the Western countries basically promised to deindustrialize and bankrupt the middle class and shut down their productive capacity. And the Chinese promised to absorb all the productive capacity that was being shut down across the Western world and emit way more CO2 in the process than those same industries would have emitted in America or New Zealand or Japan or whatever. So this is a fraud. The people at the top know it's a fraud. It's about stealing our freedom. It's about stealing our money. And it's all based on lies. And so now they're in this situation where they say, hey, people are figuring it out. People don't believe us. Again, polling data shows Americans don't believe their narrative. So they're left with the option of we're just going to silence everybody who speaks out against it, who exposes us. And then you're in a situation like the Soviet Union where everybody knows they're lying, but we don't want to talk to each other about it. We can't talk to each other about it because we might get a bad points on our social credit score system, and then we won't be able to have a good job. We won't be able to feed our families, or worse, they might break up our families. So that seems to be the route that they're going now. It's just you just got to go full blown totalitarian because the other measures aren't working.
Well, basically, when they talk about misinformation and disinformation, let's be real. What they really mean is anything that contradicts what they want you to believe, what the official narrative is. It doesn't matter if it's true or false. They can just label it as disinformation or misinformation to cover up the fact that it probably in a lot of cases is true. Okay, there is some genuine disinformation out there, and if you're in this kind of, I don't know, what do you want to call it, truther community or whatever, you find tons of it out there, and you have to sift through it. So there is a lot of nonsense out there and that too, but the fact of the matter is if you are trying to control it at a global level, basically what you're saying is you agree with us or we will deal to you.
Yep. And that I think there's a deliberate agenda to mix in a lot of really stupid things with truth. So if you look at these UNESCO reports, they put out another one some months ago where they called for the schools now have to wage war on conspiracy theories. And they give some examples of conspiracy theories like people who don't believe man is really causing global warming and people who believe Michelle Obama is a lizard. What do those two things have in common with each other? Nobody believes Michelle Obama is a lizard, right? Yeah. Plenty of people believe she's a man. Nobody that I know of believes she is a lizard. Yeah. And so it's obviously fake information, and they mix it in with something that's credible, that's believed by a lot of people, like the election fraud. Right? They got election fraud, climate skepticism, and then Michelle Obama is a lizard. Obviously, those things are not compatible. Those things don't belong in the same sentence. But on the subject of misinformation and disinformation, that's not just you and me saying this, Tony. I want to quote from a report that just came out earlier this month from the U.S. Congress. We've got committees in our Congress just like you have in your Parliament. And so the House Judiciary Committee is a very, very powerful committee in our House of Representatives. They released a 56-page report earlier this month. And the name of the report was called The Weaponization of Disinformation, Pseudo-Experts, and Bureaucrats, How the Federal Government Partnered with Universities to Censor Americans' Political Speech. And I read this whole report. It was very interesting. Some really interesting quotes from here that I want to read for people so that you understand this isn't just Alex and Tony saying that disinformation is a term they're using to silence us. This is very, very influential, serious people who are making this argument. They say, for example, the pseudoscience of disinformation is now and has always been nothing more than a political ruse, most frequently targeted at communities and individuals holding views contrary to the prevailing narratives. That's a direct quote from this report. They also say that these social media companies were pressured by the federal government. And here's what they say. This pressure was largely directed in a way that benefited one side of the political aisle. True information posted by Republicans and conservatives was labeled as misinformation, while false information posted by Democrats and liberals was largely unreported and untouched by the censors. Again, direct quote from a congressional investigation just released earlier this month. So, this is a very real problem that these terms, these labels like disinformation, misinformation have been weaponized to label true information as false for the purpose of silencing people. In America, we have the First Amendment. Congress is not supposed to make any law that infringes on our freedom of speech, and yet that's exactly what they've done.
Yes, and another side to this whole thing is you look at what's happened to the people from January the 6th. They get incarcerated and, for indefinite periods of time. But if somebody from Black Lives Matter or pro-Palestinian marches goes into a public, state building and tries to do something, then they basically get off with a slap on the wrist or nothing at all. So there's like two standards here.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And Tony, you and I both know the ultimate objective is actually to silence the gospel. It's actually to silence the truth of Jesus Christ. And we're starting to see this in Europe, right, where they're hauling pastors off to jail for quoting the Bible, what it says on homosexuality. Actually, the Swedish government in 2008 did an investigation of the Bible to see if it was truly a violation of its hate speech laws. And they actually concluded, and they posted this report on their website. They've since taken it down, but the Justice Ombudsman looked at this and said, yeah, the Bible is actually a violation of Swedish hate speech laws. One way you could get around it, they said, was to change the wording in the Bible. But, we're seeing this now, even in America, right, which people have long thought of as a Christian nation, a nation that had absolute protections for freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion. We're now seeing this trend where they want to ban and even criminalize what they call conversion therapy, which, they make you think this is like electrocuting people and stuff. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is telling people that Jesus Christ can set you free. Jesus Christ can transform you. He can turn your heart of stone into a heart of flesh, and you can be changed. You can be set free from your sin. They consider that to be a crime. And they are actively working to make it a crime. They want to label parents who teach these truths to their children as haters, as dangers, as threats to their own children. And ultimately, the goal is to completely criminalize free speech. They prosecuted the former Interior Minister of Finland, a member of Parliament, for saying that the the Lutheran Church of Finland, should not endorse homosexual marriage because it's contrary to the Bible. So that's where this is all going if we're not careful. It is the criminalization of the Bible and ultimately the gospel. And
you also get people arrested for praying silently within a certain distance of an abortion clinic as well.
Yep.
It's like you can't even do it in your mind.
Yep. But then you can go shriek about jihad and Allahu Akbar and all that's no problem, right? It's amazing. You can be thrown in prison for criticizing Islam or for talking about certain parts of the Quran that shouldn't be talked about. But then nothing whatsoever happens if it comes from the other side. It's so obvious what this is all ultimately designed to do. They want to criminalize free speech, and ultimately they want to criminalize the truth for obvious satanic purposes.
Yes, well, that's true. So I understand, changing the subject a bit, you're heading off to the UN Climate Summit shortly. Yeah, what can you tell us? What are you expecting from that?
So I imagine it'll be very similar to all the previous ones. There is going to be a big religious component to it. The UN Faith for Earth initiative, I got their email today from a source. They're planning big festivities there, so the whole one world religious angle will be there. And in fact, it's interesting that they chose the United Arab Emirates. One of the things that they have in the United Arab Emirates is this giant facility. They call it the Abrahamic Family House, where they've got a giant mosque, a giant synagogue, and a supposed church with no crosses, all together on one compound. Very interesting. And so this, I think there's going to be a real religious component to it, and I'll be bringing back, you and I have talked before about last year's on the Sinai Peninsula that I went to, where they came out with the new 10 Commandments, this one world religious movement. But on the political and economic front, the big news that's going to be happening, last year they had what they called the loss and damage. So they basically concluded that global warming is caused by human emissions. America and the Western world released more CO2 into the atmosphere because we invented power plants and cars and air conditioner and refrigerators and medicines. And we liberated humanity from the backbreaking manual labor, and we extended people's lifespans by 40 or 50 years. And so we are terrible, horrible people, and we need to be made to pay. And of course, under normal circumstances, you'd have a trial, right? You'd hear evidence. You'd have a jury that would look at this and say, are Americans really guilty? Do they really need to be punished for inventing all these things and creating the modern world? We could have a debate about it. Well, we didn't have a trial. John Kerry and Joe Biden showed up and pled guilty on our behalf, right? So we wouldn't have to have the messy trial and hear evidence and things like that. The evidence is settled, the consensus, that you can't discuss this anymore. So they pled guilty on our behalf. So we are guilty, and you also, New Zealand, and of course Europe and all the other Western countries that developed before other places, thanks to Christianity and biblical principles and so on. And so the next meeting, this one that's coming up here in the United Arab Emirates, starting on Friday, is going to be, I call it the sentencing hearing. These global totalitarians are going to determine just what sentence to impose on us. And of course, the punishment will mostly be measured in terms of money, right? How much money are they going to be extracting from the American middle class, or what's left of it anyway, the middle class in New Zealand, middle class in Australia, the middle class in Japan and South Korea, Europe, et cetera. How much money are they going to be fleecing from us to hand to their cronies, really the dictators, tyrants, kleptocrats that have impoverished and are continuing to impoverish the people of the third world. So that's the big one. They are talking about redesigning the world economic system. So there will be another major agreement coming out of this. I anticipate they'll probably come up with some figures. It'll probably be in the trillions of dollars over X amount of years. They're going to determine the mechanisms through which that money is going to be extracted from the middle class and handed out to the kleptocrats in the third world. So that's going to be big. I'll be reporting on all of that. I'll be bringing updates, so you can find them at thenewamerican.com. But it's very, very significant. I don't know what the situation is in New Zealand as far as media coverage goes, but in America, we have almost total radio silence when it comes to this climate change stuff. Most Americans don't even know that these things are happening, and that's very deliberate. That's very strategic. Again, they know that people don't believe this, and so the more they tell us about what's going on, the more angry people get, the more people are going to call their congressman or show up at a town hall meeting and say, what are you doing wasting our money on this clown show called the UN climate change process? So their strategy is mostly just to keep quiet and hope nobody notices that this abomination is going on. But it is going to be big. I encourage people to follow this closely. The climate change hypothesis, the idea that CO2 is causing this, is the pretext. It's the justification for so much of the global system that is being imposed on humanity right now. The CBDCs, the tracking of your carbon emissions, the 15-minute cities, the lockdowns, the destruction of the free market, the destruction of prosperity, the destruction of our energy infrastructure, the building up of communist China. I mean, so much of what is happening in the world today goes directly back to the climate change narrative. And so people need to be paying attention to this.
Yeah, it's interesting because I noticed there's been a pushback in the last few weeks about electric cars too and things like that, that people are realising this is a crazy idea. It's not sustainable. Even here in New Zealand, they were going to be building a whole lot of new charging stations, and I think that's been put on hold for a review under this new government. They're basically saying, right, we're going to start exploring for oil and gas again, so we're not having to be dependent on overseas imports. Because New Zealand has its own, but the previous government shut a lot of it down, and all of that. And things like we had speed limits lowered in a lot of places here, and they've said we're going to be looking to put most of them back up again. So we've a lot of the stuff that was put in place here in the last 6 years is going to be looking like it'll be overturned. How much difference in the end it really makes, I don't know. But also there's one of our current Deputy Prime Minister now, he's a hammerer on the media. Like he calls them, much like Donald Trump did, but he doesn't say you're all fake news, but basically it's the same sort of thing. So I don't know where it's all going to end up as far as New Zealand goes, but after what we've had for 6 years, it's looking a little bit more promising anyway, but...
Yeah. I think that's encouraging, Tony. But one of the things to remember with these evildoers is they use a strategy that they perfected a long time ago: the 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Yes. So they'll push us until the breaking point, until they know people are like ready to revolt and break out the pitchforks and the torches, and we're going to their house. And oh no, just kidding. Let's have an election. Oh yeah, we're going to walk back a lot of that craziness. But what you see is a lot of the infrastructure that was laid down during the 2 steps forward will remain and will be reactivated at a moment's notice. Yeah. So we're seeing that all over the world, and I'm not I don't know much about your new prime minister. I've heard good things about him, but I don't mean to diss some of the great political leaders that have been elected and are being elected in different parts of the world.
I don't trust our new prime minister. Let's be honest. I don't. I think it's the fact we've got a coalition of 3 different parties that are having to work together. While it has strengths and weaknesses, it also means that the one major party can't push everything through that they want. And the very first speech he ever gave as a leader of the opposition before he was prime minister, he used the word reset. And straight away I thought, aha, he's another member of the club. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Well, and that's what the Bible teaches, the attitude that we should take. We are not to put our trust in men. Mm-hmm. We are not to put our trust in princes. Our trust is to be in God and God alone. And, we're thankful. We pray for our leaders. We ask that we could lead peaceable lives, right? These are things that the Bible commands us to do. But our hope is never going to be in a politician. Our trust is never going to be in a politician. I'm grateful for some of the guys who've been elected over the last few years. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Javier Milei in Argentina. There are some people who seem to be decent, who are doing good things being elected. But, there's always more going on behind the scenes. And ultimately, to go back to that point, we need to be looking to God to save us and for everything good, not to political leaders or political processes or anything like that. But I do think, and we've talked about this before, Tony, I do think as Christians, we have an obligation to be good citizens and to be good stewards of what God has blessed us with. You and I were both very blessed to be born into a country that had, traditions of individual liberty, that had traditions of fidelity to the Bible and a Christian heritage. And I find it tremendously sad that this generation is frittering it all away. We are not being good stewards of what we inherited from our forefathers and really the blessings that ultimately come from God. And I think that's very sad. I wish Christians would take a more active role in trying, and we can't all do everything, but in trying to preserve and be good stewards of what God has blessed us with.
2 things I want to say to that. One is if you look at both our countries, you look at the attitude towards abortion, for example, and how much more liberal it is than it once was generally, and that seems to be fairly much across the board around the world. So I don't see how God is happy about that or blesses that. And the other thing I want to say is if these elite oligarchs and so on and the Bill Gateses and them think things are getting out of hand, well, they pull out the next card, which will be, let's roll out another pandemic. So we get everyone scared again and we can start bringing these controls in that with the putting through the WHO and other UN agencies and so forth.
Yeah, crisis is one of their critical tools, right? When they think that they need to make a big leap forward on some policy or they're trying to market something that's really unpopular, crisis is the order of the day. And this has been understood for a long time. The great French lawmaker, philosopher Frédéric Bastiat of the 1800s identified this trend among totalitarians. He said these people concoct the poison and the antidote in the same laboratory, right? They cause a problem and then they give us the solution. They're going to save us from the problem they created. Isn't that cute? And I think you're absolutely right, Tony. I mean, we have to recognize that my country, the United States of America, your country, all countries, actually, if we're quite honest, deserve nothing but God's judgment. I mean, we have just been absolutely wicked. It's especially true in the case of abortion. The blood of these innocent victims cries out to God for justice. And I can't imagine what the blood of 65 million unborn children sounds like. But that's the reality. America has murdered 65 million of the most innocent people that God has created. And it's a terrifying thought. And I tremble to think about, the attitude that God has toward this horrific slaughter of unborn. And it's not just that. I mean, we're exporting pornography to every corner of the world. We're making a mockery of marriage. We're brainwashing children to believe that they were born in the wrong body and that they can chop off their pride. I mean, this stuff is so outrageous. It's so grotesque. Our country deserves to be vaporized. And honestly, it deserved to be vaporized a long time ago. The only reason we're still walking around here is because God is very merciful. He's not willing that any of his people should perish. So I fully expect God's judgment. In fact, I believe in many ways our countries are already under judgment. Some of the things that people think of as causes for judgment, I think, are actually symptoms of judgment. Right? A close reading of Romans 1 shows you that one of the effects of suppressing the truth in your unrighteousness, one of the judgments for the wickedness, is actually the very things that we're seeing, the massive spread of the LGBT ideology and things like this. This is actually evidence of judgment, not just a cause for judgment. And so, yeah, to be clear, Tony, you were absolutely right. And it breaks my heart, as someone who very much appreciates my country and appreciates the heritage that it has. It breaks my heart to see what's happening, as somebody who appreciates the many generations of godly men and women who came before us and tried to preserve godly government, godly principles. It is a tragedy of epic proportions to see what is happening. But thankfully, we know that God is ultimately sovereign. None of this is happening outside of his view, as none of it is a surprise to him. And so we can be hopeful and joyful just knowing that.
Yes, that's true, Alex. So have you got any last thoughts? Well, I know you've got to get going, but have you got anything else you wanted to add before you?
Well, I hope people will be in prayer about all of this. You're absolutely right to the way you described this, Tony. I do think we're in a little bit of a reprieve right now. I think we're seeing right now maybe that one step back in some parts of the world. The election that they just had in the Netherlands, the election they just had in Argentina, what's happening in New Zealand, even here in the United States, the Republicans taking back the House and then getting rid of Kevin McCarthy from the Bohemian Grove and putting in a guy who describes himself as a Bible-believing Christian, a guy he said in public on national television, if you want to know what I believe, pick up a Bible. Right? That's the kind of leadership that we need, and it's very nice to have this little reprieve. It felt like we were going 100 miles an hour over the cliff. Now it seems like they've at least let the foot off the accelerator a little bit. But, we need to be in the Word. We need to be in prayer. We need to be asking for God's guidance through all of this. And I just appreciate what you're doing, Tony. Thank you for always bringing truth and the Word of God to people around the world, people across New Zealand. You're just a bright light in an otherwise very dark media landscape. And so appreciate you having me on. Thank you. And I hope people will be in prayer about all of this.
And thank you, Alex. It's great to have you on the show again. And just the last thing I'll say, I guess, is people mustn't forget the Hegelian dialectic, where you get them having the left and the right, and they control both sides to get people where they want. So you're 2 step forward, 1 step back. So you go far this way. All right, we've got to pull it back, So then they try and take you to where they really wanted you to go in the first place. So we mustn't forget that. But thank you, Alex, and I totally appreciate what you're doing. You also are a fantastic voice out there and so knowledgeable, and I'll be very interested to hear your feedback from the Climate Summit when that comes around.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. God bless you, and I'll look forward to talking to you soon.
Cheers. Thanks. God bless you too, Alex. Folks, A Minute to Midnight is run 100% by donations. Always greatly appreciate people that donate. And also remember to subscribe to us at our website, aminutetomidnight.com. Thanks for watching, and God willing, we'll be back with more episodes in the near future. Until then, stay safe and take care. Keep your eyes on the Lord.